let me begin by saying how pleased I am to be here with you. And thank you so much, Noel, for the invitation, but for also the work that FPA accomplishes. And to the members of the Foreign Policy Association, to the young people, dear colleagues, dear friends. It is indeed the basic right of every individual to be the owner of their physical body, of their thoughts, and to decide freely whether and when to have children, free of discrimination, free of coercion and violence. It's population data and analysis that are crucial to upholding this right. Today, world population is radically reordering itself. In November, the human family indeed surpassed 8 billion souls, the largest population that this planet has ever known. And at the same time, the global average fertility rate is the lowest in living memory. So here we have a period of extreme demographic diversity, 2/3 of us living in places with below replacement fertility, less than 2.1 children per woman, and others living in countries where, yes, there's still vigorous population growth. Some countries have a median age of 15, and others have a median age of 50. Diversity. And when we look at the ranking of the world's most populous countries, this is going to change significantly over the next 25 years. And already as we speak, as many of you would have seen, the population of India topped that of China's. So everyone wants to know what this means, and without a clear answer, I believe that there's a serious danger that human rights, and particularly reproductive rights, are going to be undermined. So let me tell you that that is already happening in certain places, with calls for either limiting family size or banning contraception in public hospitals, and women being urged to step back, step away from their careers, be a mother for the good of the nation. And of course, women are also clapping back to insist that no, they are not merely baby-making factories. So last month, when UNFPA launched our flagship State of World Population Report, titled 8 Billion Lives, Infinite Possibilities, it's about the case for rights and choices. And the report briefly has two very clear messages. First, shatter the myths that surround population. Many say the world is overpopulated. They blame fertility rates for the climate crisis, for instance. And in that fallacious thinking, in a recent survey that we conducted, we found that the most commonly held view is that the global population is too large and fertility rates are too high. And according to that kind of illogic, global warming is supposedly driven by the proliferation of human beings on a planet of finite resources. Now, when we think about it, this is the type of fallacy that holds the wrong people to account. It is just 10% of world population who are responsible for fully half of the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change. Now, let's think about countries with the highest fertility. At the moment, the country with the highest fertility is Niger. It's a country in West Africa, a vast country where the Sahara Desert is coming ever closer, where the fertility rate is actually 7 children, and this is an average per woman, meaning I may have 14, someone else may have none or 1. So this actually was typical of our grandparents' generation, where you would have however many children knowing that many of them would die. And sadly, in Niger, they also have one of the highest maternal mortality and infant mortality rates in the world, et cetera, et cetera. Yet, let's think about the life of a woman in a village in Niger. Does she have an SUV emitting carbon gas? Does she even have simple electricity, a light bulb, in her village? Well, the answer to that is no, she does not. And probably it's going to take her a lifetime to catch up to 1 year of my life in the developed West, if you will. So this woman in the Sahel with the 7 children or whatever has basically no impact on climate change, and focusing on her and her fertility rate would distract us from a real solution. If we're looking for a climate solution, we should really not turn to fertility, right? So to reduce consumption in a wealthy country would probably make much more sense than finger pointing and victim blaming her. And I also believe, on the converse, as I've mentioned, we're now at a time where, for whatever reason, fertility is declining. And actually, we've looked at the reasons, and I can tell you a lot about that if asked. But in a low fertility setting where birth rates are low, now we see that women are being blamed for aging and societal economic concerns. And in particular, this insufficient supply of baby argument ignores a lot of what does encourage women, couples, to decide to add to their families. And so these types of solutions bring us back to the rights and choices issues that I put on the table in this year, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is celebrating its 75th year. For example, aging, low fertility, it affects a lot of Europe now and many countries in Asia. How to increase productivity? Gender parity, Sustainable Development Goal number 5, has a lot to do with that solution. So, for example, in the workforce, if you have expanded access to affordable child care and parental leave, not necessarily the maternity leave concept, because raising children is a shared responsibility of the couple, hopefully of the society, and in low fertility countries. In the politicized world in which we dwell, at least let me say the United Nations right now is highly geopoliticized, the question of migration as an opportunity to address some of these labor shortages is very difficult to entertain. And in fact, for the first time in our State of World Population Report, we invited the United Nations Migration Office, IOM, to share the pages with us and give their advice as to how we can overcome some of these hurdles to orderly, legal migration, which theoretically could be a win-win for countries that are facing aging populations and loss of a labor force. So again, I think the myths about population are important to examine. We should not let them distract us from the real and powerful stories about human progress. And in fact, all populations, when we stop and think about it, are aging. This is probably a very good thing. It shows you the success of medical advances, of social advances, and hopefully as people live longer lives, and life expectancy actually has increased by almost a decade when we look since 1990. Of course, there are variations with COVID pandemia, et cetera, but as a whole, the story of human progress is really so remarkable, especially in recent years. And a lot of the variation in fertility rates, to me, is a good thing because it says that women can assert their right to do what it is that they want with their lives and livelihoods. Okay, so shattering the myths was one of the points I wanted to bring to you. And the other second main point is just to emphasize that maybe we've been asking the wrong questions. The question isn't whether the human population is too large or too small. The question really is, does everyone have the ability to exercise their fundamental human right to choose the number and spacing of their children, comma, if any? And sadly, the answer to that is a resounding no. Our latest data are revealing that it's 44%, aka almost half, of women in this world who do not have personal bodily autonomy to be able to make their own choice about contraception, to be able to decide, can I leave the house unaccompanied on my way to the clinic to seek health care for myself or a member of my family? And that same 44% cannot decide whether and with whom to have sex. So, no surprise really that globally, nearly half of all pregnancies are unintended. Simultaneously, and this is the dichotomy. Countries are aging in terms of lifespan, but we also have young populations. And here we also see that while half of pregnancies are unintended, many women do want to have more children, and they're unable to do so. Infertility treatments being what they are cost-wise, but also the proportion of women who are able to meet their own personal aspirations in terms of fertility and family size is as low as 1/4 in many low and middle income countries. And we see the reasons for this every single day in our work as UNFPA across 130 countries. And young people, still highly controversial, giving them the basic information that they need to navigate adolescence, to understand the biology of their bodies, but also their rights. And who is hugely disadvantaged? Girls. Right now, it is the African adolescent girl, which is the only cohort in the entire world where HIV is on the increase. What's different about her is that she has very little access in the main to the kind of not only life-saving information, but to the confidence that allows you to push back against any kind of coercion or the sugar daddy syndrome type of false persuasion. Now, concomitant with all of this, I will also say that we see how men and women are struggling with a lack of contraceptive choice, if they can access contraception at all. And this is a big part of the work of UNFPA, to bring contraception of the personal choice of the person, everything from condoms on through to implants, to the pill, etc., to these countries. And we also work with survivors of sexual violence. And this is probably the most horrible expression of gender inequality in the world, and it remains ubiquitous. Now, as I'm talking about our experience with structural conditions like sexism in the workplace and in the home contribute to high levels of involuntary childlessness, I also want to say that the enormous gaps that still prevail in terms of the science, the prevention, the treatment of infertility are also important to highlight. So for UNFPA, we advocate asking women and adolescent girls, because child marriage is still quite prevalent and it contributes to the high rate of maternal death that we see, to jumbo jets, as my deputies reminded me this morning, crash every single day. This was an analogy that Mahmoud Fatala, the famous doctor, used to symbolize the number of pregnant women who died today and tomorrow, pregnancy and childbirth, 800 women a day. And the Sustainable Development Goals invite us to do better. So let me just end on the note of saying that as the head of the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, UNFPA, with a staff that's really smart and really dedicated, up to this morning, helping pregnant women in Khartoum during this sudden conflict outbreak, and it really looks like everywhere you turn, you have these dilemmas. We know that history warns us of the dangers of treating women's reproductive capacities as a tool for those in power, typically in, male-dominated patriarchal power. The horrors of fertility targets have included eugenics, laws still on the books in certain countries that allow husbands to legally rape their wives. And over, we've seen how power over women's bodies seized by these structures, which could be the son, the father, the in-law, the state, really creates pervasive harm to individuals, to families, to communities, to countries in the world. And this is the role of international solidarity. This, to me, is part of the big goal of diplomacy, to put an end to such practices, to put an end to fear being weaponized. And these fears about either overpopulation or underpopulation have long been used and continue to be used to exclude and harm people, especially people who are othered, who either look different, live differently. So I think the world is not going to solve its greatest problems by treating fertility rates as the fundamental problem. That is not. And inequality continues to be that fundamental issue. Inequality in who counts and whether or not we even count them, think that they count. So as we show in this report, and as a pediatrician myself originally, it's such a tragedy to now finally have data that shows that every year in the age group 10 to 14-year-old girls, over 500,000 births take place. These are girls who are so young. I mean, they might not even realize that they can even get pregnant. And these girls are certainly too young to give consent, nor should they be married off or coerced or abused or both. And until very recently, we didn't even look at the challenge of counting births in this very young age group. So thank you again for the opportunity to address you. I believe that as UNFPA, we're actually the United Nations Population Fund by title. No, our acronym does not match. But we present ourselves as the lead agency on sexual and reproductive health and rights because starting in Cairo in 1994, when my predecessor, the great Dr. Nafis Sadik, made the point that population is not about numbers, it is about people, and that women should be at the center of development, which now we've accepted as a world with the Sustainable Development Goals. She also led us to reconfigure our agency, which of course still supports census, and 2020 with COVID and everything should have been a big census year. We're scrambling to catch up, working with other arms of the United Nations to present good data, as I've tried to do here today. Our rubric is to deliver a world where every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's potential is fulfilled. Thank you very much, and I look forward to further discussion with you. Thank you.
If you have a question, please just raise your hand, and we will pass around the microphone.
Noel, should I stay up here for now? Okay.
Thank you. Quick follow-up question. You mentioned Niger, and of course its neighboring country, Nigeria, the largest population in Africa. Many note that across the Sahel, over the next coming decades, there will be more conflict as resources are competed over. Is there special focus of your agency or of the UN writ large to try to address these issues around reproductive rights in the advent of these types of conflicts that are invariably going to happen with climate change?
Well, this is a fantastic question, and it's very troubling to note that there is an interaction between climate change. Like when I first started going to Nigeria and Chad and Niger, Lake Chad was huge. And as we've seen this lake dry up, the competition for water, the desert coming closer, conflict is sometimes the consequence of, as you're saying, arguing over resources if you're nomadic versus if you're trying to farm, etc. But there's a symbiosis between the two. For the United Nations, this is a huge preoccupation. Our Secretary General has actually named special representatives that report directly to him on these issues of Sahelian desertification, but also on conflict in the region. It's a tragedy for Africa also that as the source of so much wealth for the world, I mean, every mineral that goes into our cell phones and whatever, in fact, the oil wealth that Sudan, which as you've seen recently deteriorate into conflict, all of this has gendered consequences. I hasten to explain that many of the farmers of this region are women who are still bent over their hoe trying to get the agriculture to respond to the food security needs that they have. So not just for UNFPA, but for all of the agencies of the United Nations, this new dilemma, and you're alluding to it, is given this rubric of a nexus between the type of development that we would hope we're strengthening health systems, we're sending girls to school, we're doing like the things in the expectation that the country's economy will rise. But now with the conflict situation, the peace dynamic is just so huge because overnight you can destroy what it's taken so long to build. And the humanitarian consequences, again, my two deputies are here, and literally up to this morning, at the behest of Secretary General, we're debating what are we going to do in a place like Khartoum, where the so-called ceasefire is not holding, and our humanitarian groups are expected to go and deliver things to people who are across the street. I mean, it's such a lose-lose situation. So I think by calling attention to women as leaders in a peace process, as well as the importance of stability, we very much are on the front lines of trying to persuade governments to use dialogue as a means to resolve conflict. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Burke. I'm with the FPA Board of Directors, and I work at Citibank. So I'm a layman from UN procedures, I will say. Can you talk a little bit about how you take forward, a report of this magnitude and the recommendations within it, with the agencies within the UN, with the member states, with governments around the world to, drive the impact that you're seeking?
Well, thanks for that question, too. And I have to say that some of my team who led the research, every year the State of World Population report, and I think we gave you what do you call that square thing? Thank you. I think we gave you the QR code rather than load you up. And it also comes in language versions because we do in Spanish and French and German and other languages as well. But Rebecca Zerzan, stand please, who led the research team, she commissions experts from literally all over the world to examine questions of import, and this year we chose that milestone of 8 billion. So part of it is hoping that evidence will be persuasive. That was my naivete as a scientist coming to the UN, where now I really see that you can have all the facts in the world, right? But if the explanation is full of jargon and nobody really understands, if the young people, like the three misses here, aren't convinced that, there's hope for their future, then you can just have this ticker tape of reports and very good whatever. So the media strategy that goes with it is part of the other team that's here as well. So what we endeavor to do is to have a launch which has enough, pep so that people are interested, the hook of the 8 billion, I ruefully say that, as you saw in my talk, I mentioned India and China once, and it was embedded in all of this rhetoric about women's rights and whatever. But the New York Times and others ran with the India overtaking China headline, and that spawned attention. But we also feel that that is part of the conversation. Does having more people speak to the quality of life of the more people that you have? So I think there is a press media strategy that goes along with it. But the most important part of our State of World Population Report is that the United Nations serves governments. And in UNFPA's case, we actually work with least developed and middle income countries. Like, I'm not addressing issues of the developed North or the US or something like that on a daily basis. So for us, the understanding that we've got to win the hearts and minds, if you will, at the country level is really important. So for those 130 or so representatives, you know, the representative in Guatemala, the representative in Serbia, wherever they are, they have to translate what this means in their backyard. So if you're working in a country like Moldova, for example, bordering Ukraine, absorbing a lot of new refugees coming across the border, but also understanding that there's low fertility there, and they're worried about young people who, in many of the Eastern European countries, may be leaving. How do we guarantee employment? You know, Nigeria was put on the table. The doubling time of the population in Nigeria is estimated at about 20 years. And the more you have adolescent pregnancy, the more you have, the population pyramid with older people at the top and babies at the bottom, the more you have a young population, and you can have grandmothers, at the age of 30, 35, the more young people you're going to have year after year. So even as I'm saying that world population is 8 billion, it's not going to logarithmically, forever more grow. The rate of growth is slowing. As I said, a lot of us are in places now where women are choosing to have 2 or less, which would have been replacement. But the growth is going to continue till 10 billion, potentially 8 billion, because there are just so many young people in the world. It's a country by country analysis, but we also hope that people will learn from each other. So, for example, we convened a team in Bulgaria last year to speak about low fertility. I didn't tell you which country has the lowest fertility. Does anybody know? Does anybody want to guess? That's Korea. I heard someone say it's South Korea, where the average fertility rate now is 0.8. So that's less than 1. And of course, a concern as societies get older, where is the labor force going to come for that pension plan and everything else that goes along with demographics? So it's a very interesting time to present our analyses and hopefully persuade governments to take positive action that doesn't try to dictate to women, you have 1, you have none, you have 3, whatever, and also exposes the risks of this kind of prescribing for women, because we've seen how people with disabilities, people of African descent, indigenous people, you name it, we have a lot of history to show that this is never going to be a good thing. Thanks.
Name's Angela Aquino. I'm the founder of Equal Rights for Children. We're an advocate for children born out of wedlock and their rights and their mothers. Right now, there's a lot of women choosing whether, by their own or through external factors to bear children without having to be married. So in that effect, there are several countries that treat these children discriminatory. How can the UNFPA help resolve the issues of countries such that don't treat these children and women equally?
Well, I would say this is really a great question, and it goes to the heart of the matter. The noble purpose of the United Nations being peace based on a human rights approach. The Declaration of Human Rights and the Charter itself assert that everyone is equal. So the circumstance of birth should not in any way factor in to the fate of a child, or actually the stigma that in some places attaches to the mother. For UNFPA, I think, again, everywhere we stand up for rights and choices, but as a practical matter, in countries where the law sits in the type of situation where you've described, there's a role for us to really be vocal with a number of societal figures. As UNFPA, even though there's a lot of controversy always about things like unsafe abortion, things like LGBTIQ rights, certainly sexuality education for young people, we've seen the wisdom of crossing the street and working, for example, with faith-based organizations that can do a lot to reduce stigma, you know, from somebody with HIV or whatever it is. But the discussion, which is typically taboo and a source of shame for the individual, also needs to be brought up into the light. So I think as we work with young people, and we have a legion of very devoted young people who actually know all about the ICPD, Cairo Program of Action, etc., part of it is to say that respect for each other's dignity, and this is also very true for gender-based violence as well. In a sense, this is an offshoot of not respecting the rights and choices of the mom and now the child that's there. Ultimately, we work in concert with groups like UNDP, UN Women, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to be able to help give guidance, as they call it, to countries to change the law, because where there's discrimination in law, then again, you know, it just leads to the types of inequalities that we're speaking about. I've also seen, you know, the stigma that attaches to children born of rape, because our job in the humanitarian sector is to counsel, psychosocial and referral counseling for people who are victimized by sexual violence. And here, again, I think it's really important to destigmatize the understanding that if a woman is assaulted, we should not blame her nor stigmatize her child. This is work that people like Nadia Murad have spearheaded in terms of her personal experience and leadership. And we do try to ally with people on the ground in the communities who are facing these issues and try to lend support as best we can. So I'm really happy to hear that your organization is there. And this is a perfect alliance as far as UNFPA as well. So thanks.
Does the Anglican Church work with you all in Africa? Is that one of the ones that helps?
The short version is yes. And again, I think for us, there's a lot of complexity in working with faith-based organizations. For example, the religious beliefs, and, you know, across the spectrum, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, et cetera, sometimes allow church communities to work only on maternal mortality. They may or may not have a view, for example, on LGBTIQ, which is really tough to discuss right now, and also, quote unquote, the definition of the family. So being a scientist, I'm an epidemiologist, and I think I mentioned I'm a pediatrician as well. The question of gender is difficult for society right now. It's new. A lot of us, you know, in my age group, I'm 68, as a pediatrician, I've seen ambiguous genitalia. I've had to counsel parents whose child has more than one set of chromosomes, et cetera, et cetera. But for the average lay person, it's male and female. And so it's very difficult, and I get challenged a fair amount by people whose religious beliefs is completely binary, and that's it. So I think as science elucidates some of this, what I would term diversity, sexual diversities, society, much like the whole AI debate right now, is racing to keep up. And I think some of that is also age and generational. But yet and still, for UNFPA, the space for dialogue is really, really important. Because honestly, any of us here can go across the street and preach to the family what we think they should be doing. But the intimacy of the family and the human values that we espouse are reinforced by people who we know and love. So much better for UNFPA to work in concert with whoever is important to the 10-year-old girl that we envision as our purpose, making her life better, making it safe for her to navigate her adolescence. If that's her imam, we need to be able to converse. In Niger, which I mentioned earlier, we have traditional chiefs, and what they say is what goes, and they're men. So we have started husband schools to help the chiefs reach out to other men and say, your daughter is at risk of dying if she doesn't go have her birth in the hospital with the complications or whatever it is. So I think we try to be creative and to understand that, we have to respect other people's opinions, but we also have to insist on bringing evidence to the table and telling the truth as we understand it.
I think on that note, and I can't help but add that in Niger, having lived in Niger, that the Marabout plays a very important role as well.
Absolutely.
And it was the subject of a book I wrote, Crisis in the Sahel, many years ago. But we can't thank you enough. You are our Marabout tonight.
Thank you so much.